The rain lashed against the windows of 221B Baker Street, each drop hammering the glass like the ticking of an unseen clock counting down to an unknown tragedy. I had just set aside my medical journal when the front doorbell rang a sharp, insistent chime that echoed through the house. Holmes, reclining in his armchair with his long fingers steepled, merely exhaled. "We have a visitor, Watson, a man of considerable distress." I frowned. "How can you tell?" Holmes smiled faintly. The urgency of his knock, the irregular pattern of mind in disorder, and, if my ears do not deceive me, I detect the subtle tremor of wet leather boots. "Our guest has walked a considerable distance in the storm, though he has passed by at least 2 hansoms." A moment later, Mrs. Hudson opened the door, and a man staggered inside. He was soaked to the bone, his coat hanging heavily over his thin frame. His gaunt face was pale, and his eyes wild, darting held the unmistakable glint of a man on the precipice of disaster. "Mr. Holmes," he gasped, "I am a dead man." Holmes regarded our visitor coolly as I helped him to a chair. "I would find that statement, exceedingly difficult to verify, sir, as you were still breathing." The man exhaled a ragged breath, running a trembling hand through his damp, grained hair. "My name is Edgar Wren. I am a clerk for Rhodes and Carter Banking House, and until 3 days ago, my life was entirely unremarkable." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Until 3 days ago." Swallowed hard. "Yes, that was the day I discovered something I was never meant to see." Holmes' expression did not change, but I knew the signs of his interest, the slight narrowing of the eyes, the subtle twitch of his fingers as they drummed against the chair's armrest. "What did you discover, Mr. Wren?" The man hesitated, his lips parting, his breath shallow. Then, before he could speak, a gunshot shattered the silence. The window pane exploded, glass flying in all directions as Wren lurched forward with a choked cry, collapsing onto the carpet. "Down!" Holmes barked. I dropped to the floor, my heart hammering. Holmes had already sprung into motion, throwing open the sitting room door and bolting down the stairs with a graceful swiftness. Lestrade, who had just arrived at the bottom of the stairs, nearly collided with him. "Holmes, what the devil was that?" Holmes did not answer. He was already at the door, sharp eyes scanning the rain-drenched street beyond. I knelt beside Wren, pressing 2 fingers against his neck. His pulse was faint, erratic, but he was alive. The shot came from across the street. I called to Holmes. "The angle suggests." Holmes cut me off. "The assassin is already gone." Lestrade cursed. "A bloody sniper." Holmes exhaled. "Indeed. A professional, no doubt." He turned back to me. "Watson, tend to Mr. Wren. He has not yet finished his story." I nodded, already ripping open my medical bag, my hands moving on instinct. Holmes' voice was calm, yet razor sharp. "Lestrade, gather your men." He turned back toward the shattered window, his gaze like steel. "We are dealing with a killer who does not miss twice." An hour later, Wren lay bandaged upon our sofa, his face pale but resolute. The bullet had grazed his shoulder, missing anything vital, but the shock of the attack had left him shaken. Holmes sat across from him, fingers steepled, his expression unreadable. "Now, Mr. Wren, you must tell us everything." Wren nodded weakly. 3 days ago, I made a mistake." "Go on." Wren licked his dry lips. "I was working late at the bank, going over the private ledgers. I was never supposed to handle those records. They were restricted to senior partners only." Holmes' gaze sharpened. "But you saw something, didn't you?" Wren swallowed. "A single name." "A name I recognized." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Whose?" Wren hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Lord Alfred Montague." The room fell into silence. Lestrade exhaled sharply. "Good Lord, the same Lord Montague who disappeared 10 years ago. Wren nodded feverishly. Yes, but according to those records, he was making deposits just last week. I stared at him. Montague is dead. Holmes finished. His fingers tightened slightly, his mind already turning through the implications. Lestrade scratched his head. So what you're saying is this man Montague, presumed dead for a decade, has been secretly handling finances through your bank. Not just handling, Wren murmured. He was moving immense sums of money through names that did not exist, companies that were nothing but phantoms on paper. Holmes tilted his head slightly. Laundering operation. Wren exhaled. In the moment I saw that name, I knew I was in danger. Holmes drummed his fingers against his chin. And so you ran? Wren nodded weakly. I planned to go to the police, but before I could, someone tried to kill me. I've been running ever since. Holmes stood suddenly, his gaze glinting with a new sharpness. Watson, stay with Wren. Lestrade, I need you to secure the bank's ledgers immediately. Lestrade frowned. You think someone would try to destroy them? Holmes smiled faintly. I do not think, Lestrade. No. Lestrade muttered a curse. I'll get my men on it. Holmes turned back to Wren. You said Montague's name appeared last week. That means someone in that bank is still involved in whatever scheme he was part of. Wren nodded weakly. Holmes' gaze darkened. Which means, gentlemen, that the real mystery is not why Montague vanished 10 years ago. His fingers tapped the armrest, his eyes burning with realization. The real mystery is why he has returned. A sudden gust of wind rattled the broken window, and for the first time I felt an unsettling certainty settle in my chest. The answer to that question, I feared, was something we were never meant to uncover. The rain drummed steadily against the windows of 221B Baker Street, ceaseless rhythm accompanying the mounting tension in the sitting room. Edgar Wren lay upon the sofa, his face pallid, one hand clutching his bandaged shoulder. Lestrade had already left to secure the ledgers from Rhodes and Carter, but Holmes remained seated in his armchair, fingers steepled, his sharp gaze fixed upon the fire. I observed him in silence, knowing the signs of his deep contemplation, the slight twitch of his fingertips, the narrowing of his piercing eyes, the way his breath slowed to a near meditative rhythm. Wren, shifting uncomfortably on the sofa, swallowed hard. Mr. Holmes, what do you make of it? Holmes' gaze flickered toward him. You asked. Wrong question, Mr. Wren. Wren blinked. I don't understand. Holmes leaned forward slightly. The question is not, what do I make of it? But rather, what does Montague make of you? Wren paled further, his fingers tightening upon the sofa's armrest. You mean? He knows. Holmes exhaled softly. Okay. If Lord Alfred Montague is alive, as the ledger suggests, then someone is maintaining his identity in secret. And if someone is maintaining that identity, he let the words linger. Wren finished in a whisper. Then they know I saw the records. Holmes nodded. Hence the gunshot through our window. A warning. A confirmation. You are a liability, Mr. Wren, and someone, perhaps multiple people, wishes to remedy that inconvenience. A chill settled in the room. I tightened my grip on my revolver. Then we must move quickly. If Lestrade can secure the bank's records. Holmes raised a hand, silencing me. Yes, but you must recall, Watson, that we are not dealing with common thuggery. This is a matter of great sophistication. He stood suddenly, striding toward the mantel, his hands resting upon it as he gazed into the fire. Someone has orchestrated an illusion of death for over a decade. Someone has ensured that Montague's affairs remain active despite his disappearance. That gentleman requires not just wealth, but access. Wren let out a weak chuckle, though. It was devoid of humor, and I stumbled right into it. Holmes turned, his expression unreadable. Indeed. At that moment, A rapid knock struck the door. Mrs. Hudson's voice followed, tinged with concern. "Inspector Lestrade, Mr. Holmes, and he's not alone." Holmes' eyes flickered with anticipation. "Excellent." Lestrade entered briskly, his coat dripping with rain, his expression grim. "We've a problem," Holmes gestured toward the fire. "I am certain we do, but kindly elaborate." Lestrade removed his hat, shaking the water from it before speaking. "I arrived at Rhodes and Carter banking house not 20 minutes ago with 3 of my men. I had every intention of securing the ledges as you instructed." Holmes studied him. "And," Lestrade exhaled sharply, "they're gone." A silence fell over the room. Holmes, unshaken, merely tilted his head slightly. "Gone." Lestrade nodded. "Not misplaced, not locked away." "Gone." I tensed. "But surely," Lestrade cut me off. "I spoke to the partners. They claimed that earlier today a private client arranged for their removal. The official records say it was Montague's estate that requested the transfer." Holmes' fingers tightened imperceptibly upon the mantelpiece. "And yet, Montague is," Lestrade finished, "supposed to be dead." Holmes exhaled sharply through his nose. "Watson, would you be so kind as to retrieve my violin?" I frowned. "Holmes, is this really the time?" Holmes turned sharply, his eyes alight with a keen brilliance. "Do you not see, Watson? We are no longer chasing ghosts. We are hunting the man behind the illusion." I froze. Wren sat up slightly, his brows furrowed. "Do you think Montague is still alive?" Holmes nodded once. "And I intend to find him before he finds you." Lestrade muttered under his breath. Damnation. The only person who had access to those documents was the firm's senior partner, Daniel Langley. Holmes turned to him. "Then we pay Mr. Langley a visit." Lestrade sighed. "You'll have to be quick. He's due to leave for Dover tonight." Holmes arched a brow. "Is he?" Lestrade nodded. "Seems rather convenient, if you ask me." Holmes smiled faintly. "It does indeed." I exhaled, my pulse quickening. "Then we must go at once." Holmes retrieved his greatcoat, adjusting the collar with practiced precision. "Indeed, Watson, the stage is set. The players are moving, but I do believe it is time we changed the script." By the time we arrived at Langley's residence, the night was at its deepest hour. The house loomed, dark and silent, its windows shuttered. The gas lamps lining the street, casting long shadows upon the cobblestone. Lestrade and his men flanked the entrance, hands resting upon their revolvers. Holmes held up a hand, signaling for silence. A soft glow flickered from beneath the study door. Holmes' eyes gleamed. "He's still here." Lestrade nodded to his men on my signal. Holmes placed a hand upon the door, handle and twisted. The door swung open, revealing Daniel Langley seated at his desk, the missing ledgers open before him. He did not flinch, did not show a flicker of surprise. Instead, he merely closed the book and exhaled. "I was wondering when you would arrive, Mr. Holmes." Holmes smiled faintly. "Then I regret keeping you waiting, Mr. Langley." Lestrade stepped forward. "Daniel Langley, you are under arrest." For Langley raised a hand, cutting him off effortlessly. "Please, Inspector, there is no need for dramatics." His gaze flickered to Holmes. "You already know, don't you?" Holmes tilted his head. "Perhaps, but I do enjoy a confession." Langley smirked. "Oh, I will not be confessing to anything." Lestrade scowled. "You stole those ledgers? Destroyed evidence? You think you're walking away from this?" Langley chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, Inspector, you misunderstand?" Holmes' voice was quiet. "Do we?" Langley's smile faltered slightly. "I destroyed nothing." Holmes took a slow step forward. "Then, where are the ledgers?" Langley's expression was unreadable. Then, in a low voice, he said, "They were never mine to take." Silence. Lestrade frowned. "Then, Who? Langley's gaze flickered toward the corner of the room. Holmes turned his head slightly, his keen eyes narrowing, and then, from the shadows, behind the bookshelf, a figure stepped forward. My breath caught. Holmes' voice was barely above a whisper. Lord Montague. The man before us smiled. "Ah," he said. "At last, Mr. Holmes, we meet." A clock chimed in the distance, and, in that moment, I knew the case had only just begun. The man who should have been dead stepped forward, his face half lit by the flickering gaslight, the shadows playing upon his sharp, patrician features. Lord Alfred Montague, a man who had been presumed dead for a decade. A man whose financial dealings had remained active in secrecy. And now, here he stood, alive, composed, and smiling. "Ah, Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "I do hope you'll forgive my unannounced return from the grave." Holmes remained unmoved, his piercing gaze scanning Montague's every detail, his tailored evening coat, his clean-shaven face, the slight twitch of his left hand. Finally, Holmes spoke, his tone measured. "A curious trick, Lord Montague, to vanish from the world stage only to reappear in a dimly lit study." Montague chuckled, adjusting his cuffs. "A trick, indeed. But every trick, Mr. Holmes, has its purpose." Lestrade, who had until now been stunned into silence, found his voice. You were declared dead. There was a bloody funeral." Montague turned his gaze toward him, expression calm and unbothered. "Indeed, and yet, here I am." Lestrade took a step forward, his jaw clenched. "So, what's the game, then? Oh, you've been alive all this time? You've faked your own death?" Montague smiled faintly. "It is far more complicated than that, Inspector." His gaze flickered back to Holmes. "But I suspect Mr. Holmes has already deduced the finer points." Holmes' fingers steepled, his gray eyes dark with thought. Perhaps I watched him carefully. Holmes was always quick in his deductions, but here he was waiting, observing. It meant he had a theory. But the picture was not yet complete. Montague took another step toward the desk, resting a gloved hand upon the open ledger. "Since you have been investigating my supposed demise, let me ask you this, Mr. Holmes, what is more difficult than disappearing?" Holmes did not blink. "Reappearing." Montague smiled. "Precisely." A chill settled over the room. Holmes moved slowly, his gaze locked upon Montague, as though he were dissecting a riddle, piece by piece. "You had power, Lord Montague," he said, his voice low. "Wealth, influence. You were not merely a man of means, you were a man with enemies." Montague exhaled softly. "Oh, indeed." Holmes continued, his words sharpening like a blade. "Your death was not a mere illusion, it was a necessity. Someone needed you gone, and you obliged." Montague gave a small tilt of the head, as if conceding. "A well-played move." Lestrade let out a huff of frustration. "So what now? You come back from the dead and expect a bloody handshake." Montague smiled, but there was something cold behind his eyes. "Not quite, Inspector, but I do expect an understanding." Holmes' lips curved slightly. And what understanding might that be? Montague's fingers drummed lightly against the desk. "That some men are worth more dead than alive." A silence fell over the room. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "Then why return now?" Montague's expression did not change. "Because the game has changed, Dr. Watson. Someone has made a mistake." Holmes' eyes narrowed slightly. "And who, precisely, has erred?" Montague's gaze hardened. "Whoever tried to kill Edgar Wren." Holmes' fingers tapped lightly against his lapel, his thoughts moving faster than the conversation itself. Lestrade scoffed. "You mean to say you're not behind this? That someone's trying to kill a banker, and it's got nothing to do with you?" Montague turned to him, his voice level. I assure you, Inspector, if I'd wanted Wren dead, he would be. Lestrade muttered a curse under his breath. Holmes spoke then, his voice like a scalpel cutting through the fog. You wish for us to believe that someone has been orchestrating your return without your consent, that someone has used your name and your fortune for their own ends, that, by revealing yourself, you are not playing a carefully planned hand, but rather attempting to take back control of a game already in motion. Montague smiled. You see, Mr. Holmes, you do understand. Holmes regarded him for a moment, then turned to Lestrade. Inspector, you will, of course, have Lord Montague detained for fraud, financial manipulation, and obstruction of justice. Montague let out a quiet chuckle. Oh, Mr. Holmes, ever so predictable. Lestrade stepped forward, but Montague raised a gloved hand. You may arrest me, Inspector, but I assure you, it will do nothing. Lestrade scowled. And why is that? Montague exhaled, then said two words that made the room grow cold. Cuss, I am already dead. Holmes' gaze sharpened instantly. Elaborate. Montague smiled faintly. I am a man without a legal existence. Cannot arrest a corpse. The moment I step into Scotland Yard, there will be no record of me. No case to try. No charges to press. A man who does not exist cannot be tried for a crime. Lestrade's face twisted with frustration. Bloody hell, he's right. Holmes studied Montague silently for a long moment. Then, ever so slightly, he smiled. Well played. Montague returned the smile. I thought you might appreciate the cleverness of it. Holmes exhaled, folding his hands behind his back. Then tell me, Lord Montague, you did not orchestrate this. Who did? Montague's expression darkened. That is precisely what I need you to find out. Holmes chuckled softly. Hiring me now, are you? Montague's gaze never wavered. Consider it a mutual interest, Mr. Holmes. You want the truth, and I want to live long enough to hear it. Holmes turned to me. Watson, prepare for an evening's investigation. I frowned. Where are we going? Holmes turned back to Montague. We begin where all stories of deception begin, the place where the lie was first written. Montague nodded. Then you must go to Highgate Cemetery. Holmes arched a brow. And why, pray tell, would I visit a graveyard? Montague's next words sent a shiver through me. Because Mr. Homestead is where I am buried. The carriage wheels rattled against the cobbled streets as we made our way through the midnight fog. The cold air thick with the scent of damp earth and distant coal smoke. Holmes sat opposite me, his sharp eyes reflecting the gaslight's glow, his fingers steepled in thought. Beside him, Lord Montague remained silent, his expression unreadable. Lestrade, ever the skeptic, sat beside me, arms crossed, his brows furrowed in deep suspicion. I cleared my throat. Montague, you claim you have a grave in Highgate Cemetery. If you are alive, then I must ask, who, pray tell, is buried in it? Montague exhaled softly. That, Dr. Watson, is precisely the question I have been asking myself for the past 10 years. Lestrade scoffed. Convenient, isn't it? A man vanishes, a grave is dug, and then suddenly he turns up alive just when his secret dealings come to. Light Montague's lips curled slightly. I assure you, Inspector, I did not return for pleasure. Someone attempted to recreate my death by tying loose ends. Edgar Wren's attempted murder was no accident. If I had remained hidden, my death would have remained a mystery. But if someone is trying to kill the man who uncovered my name, then they are also trying to kill the truth of what really happened to me. Holmes spoke then, his voice as calm and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. Then tell me, Lord Montague, who benefited the most from your death? Montague's gaze darkened. You assume I know? Holmes tilted his head slightly. Do you? Montague hesitated. Then, in a voice Barely above a whisper, he said, "I suspect, my own brother." A silence thickened in the carriage. Lestrade blinked. "You mean Lord Charles Montague, the current Viscount?" Montague nodded. "Indeed." Holmes exhaled slowly. "Rather bold accusation, but one that would explain much. If your brother inherited your fortune, your title, and all the influence that came with it, then your death was not merely an accident." Montague's hands clenched. "I have long suspected that Charles was involved, but I had no proof. Until now." I frowned. "You believe Charles orchestrated your murder, but someone else has been keeping your affairs alive behind the scenes." Holmes' eyes glinted in the dim light. "Most intricate deception, Watson. One we shall soon unravel." The carriage slowed, and the driver's voice called through the fog, "Highgate Cemetery, sirs." Holmes smiled faintly. "Excellent." The iron gates of Highgate stood tall and weather-worn, their blackened bars twisted with ivy. The graveyard stretched beyond them, the rows of leaning tombstones vanishing into the thick mist. The gas lamps flickered, their glow casting long shadows over the crumbling headstones. Montague led us wordlessly, his stride slow but purposeful. We followed, moving past the weathered crypts and twisted trees, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. Finally, he stopped. Before us stood a marble headstone, its inscription partially eroded by time. "Here lies Lord Alfred Montague, 1839–1872. Lestrade exhaled. "Well, that's unsettling." Holmes stepped forward, kneeling by the edge of the grave, his keen gaze sweeping the ground. He ran his fingers lightly along the soil, feeling its texture. "Recently disturbed," he murmured. I frowned. "What?" Holmes glanced at Montague. "Someone has been digging here." Lestrade scowled. "You're saying someone tampered with the body?" Holmes did not respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat, retrieving a small magnifying lens. He bent lower, inspecting the edges of the earth, his fingers tracing small indentations in the dirt. Then, suddenly, he stilled. A single mark, barely noticeable, a heel print pressed deeply into the mud. Holmes straightened. "Watson, tell me, what do you make of this?" I crouched beside him, observing the mark. It was distinct a man's boot print, but something about it was off. Then I saw it. I exhaled. This man was dragging his foot. His gait was uneven. Holmes nodded. "Indeed. And tell me, what kind of man walks with a limp?" Lestrade frowned. "An older man, perhaps, or someone recently injured." Holmes smiled faintly. "Yes, or someone who has been buried for 10 years. Montague inhaled sharply. "You're suggesting—" Holmes rose to his feet. "I am suggesting, Lord Montague, that whoever was buried in your grave is no longer there." A sudden gust of wind howled through the trees, sending dead leaves spiraling across the headstone. And then, from the darkness, soft scraping noise. We turned sharply. A figure stood in the distance, barely visible through the mist, watching us. For a moment, no one moved. Then the figure turned and fled. Holmes moved instantly after him. We raced through the graveyard, our boots crunching against the wet gravel, the fog swallowing our shapes as we pursued the mysterious figure. Holmes' lead, his movements swift and precise, his coat billowing behind him. I struggled to keep up, my pulse pounding in my ears. The figure ahead of us was limping, fast ducking between the gravestones, weaving through narrow paths, his silhouette vanishing and reappearing through the mist. Then, suddenly a shout rang out. Lestrade, who had veered off to cut him off, collided with the figure, both men tumbling into the mud. Holmes and I skidded to a stop as Lestrade scrambled to his feet, his revolver drawn. Hold it, barked. The figure lay sprawled on the ground, panting, his face hidden beneath the hood of his coat. Holmes stepped forward slowly, his sharp gaze locked onto the man's shaking form. Then, in one swift motion, he reached down and pulled back the hood. I inhaled sharply. The man's face was worn, hollow, pale as death itself. His cheekbones jutted sharply, his eyes sunken. But it was the scar across his throat that sent a chill through me. Lestrade's grip on his revolver tightened. "Who the hell is this?" Holmes' voice was barely above a whisper. "This, Lestrade, is the man buried in Montague's grave." The man's lips parted, his voice a hoarse rasp, as though unused for years. "You should not have come here." A long, eerie silence settled between us. Holmes tilted his head slightly, his eyes dark with thought. "Oh, but my dear fellow," he murmured, "I do believe you have quite a lot to tell us." The man let out a weak, rattling breath, and then, in a voice barely more than a whisper, he said, "Montague is never meant to return." A shiver ran through me. Holmes smiled slightly. "Ah, now we are getting somewhere." The mist curled around us, the graveyard deathly silent, but I had the uneasy sense that somewhere in the darkness someone was still watching. The fog curled around the silent tombstones, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and decay. Koya, the man before you's gaunt, hollow-eyed and shivering, stared at Lord Montague with something between fear and awe. His throat bore a scar, a deep, ragged line running across his skin, and his voice, when he had spoken, had been little more than a whisper. Montague was never meant to return. The words lingered in the air, unsettling in their finality. Holmes, his expression unreadable, crouched before the man, studying him with keen intensity. "You speak as though you have seen the other side of the grave, sir. Tell me, are we addressing a ghost?" The man's thin lips twitched, but it was not quite a smile. "I am no ghost," he rasped, "but neither am I the man I once was." Lestrade, still winded from the chase, huffed impatiently. "Enough riddles. Who the devil are you?" The man turned his head slowly toward the inspector. The movement was unnatural, as though his body had forgotten how to move properly. He blinked once, twice, then exhaled, long and slow. "My name," he murmured, "was Arthur Beckett." Montague, who had remained unnervingly silent, took a sharp breath. "Beckett." Holmes' eyes flickered with interest. "Ah, a name. Known to you, Lord Montague." Montague's face was pale. "He was my solicitor, my confidant." Beckett gave a slow nod. "That was before, my lord, before I was sent to my grave in your place." The gas lamps flickered as we sat within the study of Blackwood Hall, the fire casting shifting shadows upon the walls. Beckett, now wrapped in a heavy coat, sat hunched in the armchair, his thin hands trembling against a teacup Watson had provided. I sat beside Holmes, my notebook in hand, while Lestrade stood near the doorway, arms folded, his expression lined with suspicion. Holmes, ever composed, leaned forward. "Now, Mr. Beckett, I believe you owe us a rather compelling story." Beckett exhaled slowly, his bony fingers tightening around the porcelain cup. "It began the night Lord Montague died," he murmured, "or rather the night he was meant to die." Montague, seated opposite, said nothing. His eyes did not waver. Beckett continued. "I was at the Montague estate. Lord Charles had summoned me, said there was an urgent matter regarding the inheritance." Lestrade grunted. "Lord Charles Montague's brother?" Beckett nodded once. "Yes, he had always been ambitious, but that night there was something different, something cold in his eyes. He told me that Alfred," he cast a glance at Montague, "had fallen into deep disgrace, that there were Discretions the family could not afford to have exposed. Montague's jaw clenched slightly, but still, he did not speak. Beckett swallowed hard. Then he told me I was to prepare a new will. Holmes tilted his head slightly, a will that ensured he inherited everything. Beckett's fingers tightened. Precisely. He hesitated, licking his cracked lips. Right. Then something changed. I was sent away to a small estate in Sussex, instructed to keep my head down for a few weeks. I thought it was odd, but I followed orders. I frowned. What happened next? Beckett let out a shaky breath. I never made it to Sussex. The room fell silent. Holmes remained perfectly still. Explain. Beckett closed his eyes. I remember the carriage ride. I remember the driver, a man I did not recognize. I remember the way the road twisted into blackness. He shuddered. And then I remember waking up inside a coffin. A cold shiver ran through me. Holmes' gaze remained unreadable. Buried alive. Beckett gave a small, hollow nod. I screamed. I clawed at the wood until my nails bled. Hands trembled at the memory, but they must have miscalculated. The ground above me was loose, damp. I clawed my way out. Exhaled sharply. Dear God, Lestrade, now visibly uneasy, muttered, bloody hell. Beckett stared into the fire. When I escaped, I knew that someone had meant for me to die in that grave. His hollow eyes turned to Montague, and I knew that they had meant for it to be you. Holmes tapped his fingers against his armrest, his expression one of intense concentration. Then the answer is clear. The intention was not merely to kill Lord Montague. He turned to Montague. They meant to erase you. Montague's jaw tightened, and they succeeded. Lestrade exhaled sharply. But why use Beckett? Holmes' eyes glinted in the firelight. A most elegant solution. Beckett was close to Montague in build, stature, even age. In the confusion, the body buried under Montague's name would never be questioned. I swallowed. Handariel. Montague, Holmes sighed. Likely held captive, hidden away, but not killed outright. Montague exhaled slowly. So my brother. He played the role of grieving relative, gained my title, my fortune, my standing in society. Beckett's voice was barely above a whisper. Yes, and he was not alone. Holmes' gaze snapped toward him. Now we arrive at the crux of it. Beckett swallowed. Lord Charles was only part of the plan. He lifted his gaze to Montague. There was another man who orchestrated everything. Montague's face hardened. Beckett's breath was shallow, as though saying the name itself was dangerous. Finally, he spoke. Rupert Hale. Montague stiffened instantly. Lestrade frowned. Who the hell is Rupert Hale? Montague's voice was low, controlled, but there was something terribly cold beneath it. Rupert Hale was my father's closest confidant, he said. A man who was always in the shadows, whispering in his ear. Holmes nodded, his expression unreadable. A man who held power without ever having to stand in the light. Akadi's fingers clenched. He was the one who ordered my burial. I am certain of it. Holmes leaned back in his chair. Then we have our next move. Montague met Holmes' gaze. Find Rupert Hale. Holmes smiled faintly. Oh, I suspect he shall find us first. A clock chimed in the distance, breaking the silence, and for the first time since the case began, I felt a deep, creeping dread. The streets of London were slick with rain, the gas lamps flickering like ghostly sentinels in the fog as our carriage clattered over the cobblestones. Holmes sat opposite me, his expression taut with thought, his fingers tapping an irregular rhythm against the handle of his cane. Beside him, Lord Montague remained rigid, his jaw clenched. He had not spoken since we left Blackwood Hall. Lestrade, His coat still damp from the night air, let out a huff. I still don't like this, Holmes. Holmes, still staring out at the passing cityscape, finally responded. Your approval, Lestrade, is always a welcome luxury, but not a necessity. Lestrade scowled. We're walking into a viper's den. Rupert Hale isn't some common criminal. He's been pulling strings for years. If Beckett is right, he's the one who orchestrated Montague's disappearance. You think he'll just welcome us in for tea? Holmes smiled faintly. On the contrary, I suspect Hale is expecting us. Montague finally spoke, his voice low and controlled. Hale is a dangerous man, Mr. Holmes. He has remained in the shadows for decades. He never acts without reason. Holmes turned his piercing gaze on him. Then let us give him one. Montague's lips pressed into a thin line. And if he refuses to speak, Holmes exhaled softly again. I shall simply convince him otherwise. The carriage slowed. We had arrived. Hale's residence was a monolithic estate in the heart of Pall Mall. A house of imposing grandeur, its tall windows darkened, its stone facade looming against the lamplight as we stepped from the carriage. A butler awaited us at the door, his face a mask of polite indifference. Holmes handed him his card. Sherlock Holmes. I believe Mr. Hale is expecting us. The butler merely inclined his head. This way, gentlemen. He led us through a long corridor, the walls adorned with portraits of unsmiling men, their piercing eyes following us as we passed. Holmes muttered, a fine collection of ancestors, each more disapproving than the last. The butler ignored him. At last, we entered a dimly lit study, where Rupert Hale awaited us. Rupert Hale was a man of cold precision, his sharp cheekbones and silver-streaked hair giving him an air of calculated authority. He sat behind a mahogany desk, his fingers steepled, his gaze as steady as a serpent watching its prey. Mr. Holmes, he greeted smoothly. How unexpected. Holmes, unfazed, smiled faintly. Oh, come now, Mr. Hale. We both know you anticipated this visit. Hale's lips curled slightly. Perhaps. Montague took a step forward, his voice tight with anger. You had me buried alive. Sighed, as though discussing an unfortunate business matter. Not quite. I merely ensured you would not be an inconvenience. Lestrade, visibly seething, growled. That's rich. It's coming from a man who's had his fingers in more crimes than half the men in Newgate prison. Hale leaned back slightly, amused. And yet, I have never once been charged. That is the difference between power and misfortune, Inspector. Holmes cut through the conversation like a scalpel. Huh? You played a long game, Mr. Hale. You orchestrated Montague's disappearance, ensured his brother inherited his title, and then what? Continued moving his assets in the shadows. Hale studied Holmes, his gaze unreadable. Finally, he exhaled. You're an intriguing man, Mr. Holmes. I see now why so many fear your deductions. Holmes tilted his head slightly. And yet, you do not. Hale's thin smile remained. Fear is for men without contingency plans. Montague's fists clench. Tell me, did my brother know? Hale turned to him, his expression mildly amused. Ah, Charles. Such an eager air, but not particularly bright. He did not ask too many questions. I ensured that he got what he wanted, the title. A fortune while I took what truly mattered. Holmes leaned forward slightly. And what was that? Hale's smile vanished. Control. Silence settled over the room. Then, softly, Holmes murmured, and yet, you made a mistake. Hale arched a brow. Did I? Holmes smiled. You left a loose end. Hale's fingers tightened imperceptibly against the desk. Lestrade smirked. And we all know what happens when men like you leave loose ends. Hale exhaled. A T. I assume you're referring to Edgar Wren. Montague's eyes darkened. You tried to kill him. Hale gave an elegant shrug. Unfortunate necessity. He stumbled upon information he was never meant to see. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. Yes, I imagine it was quite inconvenient for you when Wren saw Montague's name in the ledgers. That meant someone, perhaps even yourself, had been keeping Montague's identity alive. Hale's jaw tightened briefly, but he said nothing. Holmes pressed on. And then there was Beckett. A mistake you thought long buried. Yet here he is, crawled from the grave you left him in. For the first time, Hale's mask faltered. Holmes' eyes gleamed in the low light. You have kept yourself hidden for decades, Mr. Hale, a master of manipulation. And yet, in your arrogance, you forgot a fundamental truth. Hale's voice was quiet, measured. And what is that? Holmes smiled. The dead do not stay buried. A silence fell over the room, thick with tension, and then the door burst open. A policeman entered, followed by two more men in plain clothes. Lestrade smirked. Rupert Hale, you're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, attempted murder, and about a dozen other crimes. Hale's expression did not change, but I saw a flicker of something cold in his eyes. Holmes, watching him carefully, said, Tell me, Mr. Hale, did you prepare for this contingency? For the first time, Hale's smile vanished entirely. Lestrade stepped forward, fastening the iron cuffs around his wrists. You overplayed your hand, Lestrade said. Hale sighed. So it seems. As Hale was escorted away, Montague let out a slow breath, as though releasing 10 years of weight. He turned to Holmes. It is finished. Then Holmes studied him. Nearly, Montague frowned. What do you mean? Holmes watched the door where Hale had been led away, his gaze dark, thoughtful. I wonder, he murmured. E murmured. Lestrade raised a brow. Wonder what? Holmes' fingers tapped against his cane. Whether Rupert Hale was truly the master of this game, or if he was merely another piece on the board. A chill ran through me. Holmes exhaled, turning back toward the fireplace. This case is almost over, Watson, he said softly. Almost. The fire crackled, and beyond the window, the fog thickened once more. The air in 221B Baker Street was thick with the scent of pipe smoke, curling in blue-gray wisps around the dimly lit study. Holmes sat at his desk, his fingers steepled, his gaze fixed upon the single piece of paper before him. It had arrived. That morning, an unmarked envelope slipped through a letterbox. Inside, only a single sentence had been scrawled in an elegant, measured hand. You have won the battle, Mr. Holmes, but not the war. Lestrade, pacing near the hearth, scoffed. A bloody, anonymous threat, is it? Montague, seated in the corner, exhaled sharply. This means Rupert Hale was not the true mastermind. Holmes did not look up. Of course not. Lestrade frowned. Dan, who? Holmes tapped a finger against his chin, his gaze never leaving the note. The greater the deception, the more carefully placed the puppet strings. Hale was an architect of crime, yes, but he was still a servant to someone else's design. I folded my arms. But who else would benefit from this elaborate scheme? Holmes glanced at Montague. Your brother? Montague stiffened. Charles, you think he was the one pulling the strings? Holmes exhaled softly. That is the question, is it not? He reached for his violin, plucking at the strings absently as his mind churned through possibilities. Then, suddenly, he stopped. His eyes gleamed. Of course, he murmured. Lestrade turned sharply. What? Holmes set down the violin. It was never about your inheritance, Montague. Montague frowned. What do you mean? Holmes rose from his chair, his sharp gaze locking onto Montague. Tell me, when you first met Rupert Hale, how old were you? Montague hesitated. I was only a boy. He was always around my father's estate, advising on legal matters. Holmes nodded. And when your father passed, what became of Hale? Montague exhaled. He remained a close confidant to my brother. Holmes gave a small, triumphant nod. Then I believe we have our answer. Lestrade blinked. You do? Holmes reached for his greatcoat, already moving toward the door. Oh, indeed. We are about to pay a visit to Lord Charles Montague. Montague pushed to his feet. If you are right, Holmes, then I am walking into the home of the man who tried to have me killed. Holmes smiled faintly. And I do hope he will be expecting us. We arrived at Montague Manor just after dusk, the ivy-choked halls bathed in the last dying light of day. The butler, a severe-looking man with a thin mustache, greeted us with polite indifference. My lord, he said, bowing to Montague. His gaze flickered uneasily toward Holmes and Lestrade. Your brother is expecting you. Montague stiffened. He is. The butler nodded once. Indeed. He awaits you in the study. Holmes exhaled softly. How very convenient. We were led down a dimly lit corridor, our footsteps echoing against the polished wooden floors. The weight of the house's history pressed upon us, its walls lined with portraits of Montague ancestors, each one staring silently as we passed. Finally, we reached a set of heavy oak doors. The butler stepped aside. His lordship is within. Knock. Montague hesitated for only a moment before pushing the doors wide open. Inside, Lord Charles Montague stood beside a roaring fireplace, a glass of brandy in one hand, his other tucked into his waistcoat. He was a man of distinguished appearance, his once youthful features hardened by age, his expression calm, unreadable. Brother, he greeted, his voice smooth, even. I must say, I did not expect you to come so unannounced. Montague strode forward, his jaw clenched. And yet, you were expecting me. Charles' thin lips curved slightly. Of course, his gaze flickered toward Holmes. I assume we have you to thank for this visit, Mr. Holmes. Holmes smiled faintly. Oh, do not thank me yet, Lord Montague. Charles chuckled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. And what accusation do you bring to my doorstep? Holmes stepped forward, his gaze never wavering. That you orchestrated the disappearance of your own brother. A beat of silence. Then Charles laughed, a quiet, measured chuckle. My dear Holmes, he said, shaking his head. You disappoint me. Do you think me so cruel? Montague gritted his teeth. You took everything from me. Charles sighed. I took nothing. I merely accepted what was given. Lestrade scoffed. Given. Your brother's murder was orchestrated. Charles' eyes gleamed. Ah, but he was not murdered, was he? Holmes took a single step forward. Then tell us, Lord Montague. If not you, then who? Charles took a long sip of his brandy, then exhaled. Rupert Hale. Montague froze. What? Charles sighed. He came to me with an offer. He said my brother was a liability. His eyes darkened, that he needed to disappear. But it was never my plan. Holmes tilted his head. And yet, you did nothing to stop it. Charles' grip on his glass tightened. I was weak. Montague's voice shook with fury. You knew, and you let them bury me. Charles' expression was unreadable. I did. Lestrade exhaled. So that's it then. You let Hale do your dirty work. Holmes, however, was not satisfied. He watched Charles for a long moment, his gaze like a knife peeling away layers of deceit. Then, softly, he murmured, You are still lying. Charles' jaw tensed. Holmes took another step. There is something you are not telling us. Montague's voice was low, dangerous. Charles, look at me. Charles swallowed hard, then whispered, He was supposed to die. A heavy silence fell. Montague's fists clenched. "You ordered it." Charles' breath hitched. "No, only agreed to. The plan, Hay said, it was necessary." That he faltered, his voice shaking. Holmes' eyes narrowed. "That, what?" Charles' voice was barely a whisper. That Montague had found out something. Something about our father. Montague froze. Holmes inhaled sharply. "The inheritance," he murmured. "It was never about the fortune." Montague's voice was tight, strained. Then what the hell was it about? Charles' hands trembled. "Our father wasn't who we thought he was." Holmes straightened instantly, and I, for the first time in this case, felt a terrible unease settle in my bones. Something deeper was at play here, and I was no longer certain that we truly understood what had been set into motion. The air in 2-1B Baker Street was thick with the scent of pipe smoke, curling in blue-gray wisps around the dimly lit study. Holmes sat at his desk, his fingers steepled, his gaze fixed upon the single piece of paper before him. It had arrived. That morning unmarked envelope slipped through our letterbox. Inside, only a single sentence had been scrawled in an elegant, measured hand. "You have won the battle, Mr. Holmes, but not the war." Lestrade, pacing near the hearth, scoffed. "A bloody, anonymous threat, is it?" Montague, seated in the corner, exhaled sharply. "This means Rupert Hale was not the true mastermind." Holmes did not look up. "Of course not." Lestrade frowned. "Then who?" Holmes tapped a finger against his chin, his gaze never leaving the note. "Okay. The greater the deception, the more carefully placed the puppet strings." "Okay. Hale was an architect of crime." "Yes, but he was still a servant to someone else's design." I folded my arms. But who else would benefit from this elaborate scheme? Holmes glanced at Montague. "Your brother?" "Okay." Montague stiffened. "Charles, you think he was the one pulling the strings?" Holmes exhaled softly. "That is the question, is it not?" He reached for his violin, plucking at the strings absently as his mind churned through possibilities. Then, suddenly, he stopped. His eyes gleamed. "Of course," he murmured. Lestrade turned sharply. "What?" Holmes set down the violin. "It was never about your inheritance, Montague." Montague frowned. What do you mean?" Holmes rose from his chair, his sharp gaze locking onto Montague. "Tell me, when you first met Rupert Hale, how old were you?" Montague hesitated. "I was only a boy. He was always around my father's estate, advising on legal matters." Holmes nodded. "And when your father passed, what became of Hale?" Montague exhaled. "He remained a close confidant to my brother." Holmes gave a small, triumphant nod. "Then I believe we have our answer." Lestrade blinked. "You do?" Holmes reached for his greatcoat, already moving toward the door. "Oh, indeed. We are about to pay a visit to Lord Charles Montague." Montague pushed to his feet. "If you are right, Holmes, then I am walking into the home of the man who tried to have me killed." Holmes smiled faintly. "And I do hope he will be expecting us." We arrived at Montague Manor just after dusk, the ivy-choked halls bathed in the last dying light of day. The butler, a severe-looking man with a thin mustache, greeted us with polite indifference. "My lord," he said, bowing to Montague, though his gaze flickered uneasily toward Holmes and Lestrade. "Your brother is expecting you." Montague stiffened. "He is." The butler nodded once. "Indeed, he awaits you in the study." Holmes exhaled softly. "How very convenient." We were led down a dimly lit corridor, our footsteps echoing against the polished wooden floors. The weight of the house's history pressed upon us, its walls lined with portraits of Montague ancestors, each one staring silently as we passed. Finally, we reached a set of heavy oak doors. The butler stepped aside. "His lordship is within, Montague." hesitated for only a moment before pushing the doors wide open. Inside, Lord Charles Montague stood beside a roaring fireplace, a glass of brandy in one hand, his other tucked into his waistcoat. He was a man of distinguished appearance, his once youthful features hardened by age, his expression calm, unreadable. "Brother," he greeted, his voice smooth, even. "I must say, I did not expect you to come so unannounced." Montague strode forward, his jaw clenched. "Yet, you were expecting me?" Charles' thin lips curved slightly. "Of course." His gaze flickered toward Holmes. "I assume we have you to thank for this visit, Mr. Holmes." Holmes smiled faintly. "Oh, do not thank me yet, Lord Montague." Charles chuckled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "And what accusation do you bring to my doorstep?" Stepped forward, his gaze never wavering. "That you orchestrated the disappearance of your own brother." A beat of silence. Then Charles laughed, a quiet, measured chuckle. "My dear Holmes," he said, shaking his head, "you disappoint me. Do you think me so cruel?" Montague gritted his teeth. "You took everything from me." Charles sighed. "I took nothing. I merely accepted what was given." Lestrade scoffed. "Given? Your brother's murder was orchestrated." Charles' eyes gleamed. "Ah, but he was not murdered, was he?" Holmes took a single step forward. "Then tell us, Lord Montague. If not you, then who?" Charles took a long sip of his brandy, then exhaled. "Rupert Hale." Montague froze. "What?" Charles sighed. "He came to me with an offer. He said my brother was a liability." His eyes darkened, that he needed to disappear. "But it was never my plan." Holmes tilted his head. "And yet, you did nothing to stop it." Charles' grip on his glass tightened. "I was weak." Montague's voice shook with fury. "You knew, and you let them bury me." Charles' expression was unreadable. "I did." Lestrade exhaled. "So that's it then. You let Hale do your dirty work." Holmes, however, was not satisfied. He watched Charles for a long moment, his gaze like a knife peeling away layers of deceit. Then, softly, he murmured, "You are still lying." Charles' jaw tensed. Holmes took another step. "There is something you are not telling us." Montague's voice was low, dangerous. "Charles, look at me." Charles swallowed hard, then whispered, "He was supposed to die." A heavy silence fell. Montague's fists clenched. "You ordered it." Charles' breath hitched. "No, only agreed to. The plan, Hill said it was necessary." "Tat," he faltered, his voice shaking. Holmes' eyes narrowed. "That what?" Charles' voice was barely a whisper. "That Montague had found out something. Something about our father." Montague froze. Holmes inhaled sharply. "The inheritance," he murmured. "It was never about the fortune." Montague's voice was tight, strained. "Then what the hell was it about?" Charles' hands trembled. "Our father wasn't who we thought he was." Holmes straightened instantly, and I, for the first time in this case, felt a terrible unease settle in my bones. Something deeper was at play here, and I was no longer certain that we truly understood what had been set into motion. A heavy silence settled in Lord Charles Montague's study, thick as the fog that curled against the windows. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the mahogany shelves. But even its warmth could not dispel the cold weight of revelation. Charles' hands trembled, his knuckles white against the glass of brandy he held. His voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper. "Our father wasn't who we thought he was." Across the room, Lord Alfred Montague remained deathly still, his gaze locked upon his brother. His face, already pale from the night's revelations, seemed to harden into something unreadable. Holmes did not blink. His keen gray eyes were fixed upon Charles, watching every movement, every flicker of hesitation, like a hawk poised above its prey. Finally, he spoke, his voice measured and quiet. "Elaborate." Charles swallowed. "Hey, he told me our father had secrets, that he had been involved in something terrible, that if Alfred ever discovered the truth, it would ruin the entire family." Montague exhaled sharply. "And so, you tried to kill me to keep it hidden." Charles flinched, his fingers tightening on the brandy glass. I didn't order your death, Alfred. I only agreed that you should be removed." Lestrade scoffed. "Huh, because that makes it better." Charles' gaze darkened. I was trying to protect the family name. He turned to Montague, his voice tight with desperation. "You don't understand, Alfred. If you had uncovered the truth, you would have destroyed everything." Holmes tilted his head slightly. "And what truth was that, Lord Charles?" Charles hesitated. Holmes took a single step forward, his gaze piercing. "Tell me what Rupert Hale knew." Charles swallowed hard. Hale, he wasn't just our father's legal advisor. He was his fixer. A tense beat of silence. Holmes' eyes gleamed in the firelight. "Go on." Charles took a shuddering breath. "Our father wasn't just a nobleman. He had power, yes, but not all of it was inherited. He made his fortune through unorthodox means." Montague's jaw clenched. "What means?" Charles met his gaze. "Murder?" The word hung in the air, chilling in its simplicity. Montague's voice, when he spoke, was low and cold. "Explained." Charles exhaled shakily. "Our father wasn't just a lord. He was a businessman, a ruthless one. He controlled shipping lines, investments, debts, but what no one knew was that he also controlled people." Holmes' fingers steepled together, his voice silken and sharp. "You mean blackmail?" Charles nodded once. "Not just blackmail, coercion, bribes, and when that failed, disappearances." A shudder ran through me. Lestrade muttered a curse. "You mean to tell me your father had people killed?" Charles nodded, his hands trembling. "Yes, and Hale was the man who arranged it." Montague's voice was like steel. "And I was supposed to die for knowing this." Charles swallowed. "You had begun asking questions, Alfred. You were going through old ledgers, old letters. Hale warned me that if you uncovered too much, the Montague name would be ruined forever." Holmes' sharp gaze did not waver. "And yet, someone has been keeping those records alive. Someone continued moving funds in Montague's name." Charles exhaled. "That's because the operation never ended, Holmes." Holmes tilted his head slightly. "Oh." Charles gave a weak, bitter laugh. "You think Hale was the mastermind?" He shook his head. "Hale was a tool. The man who controlled the empire was someone else." Montague stiffened. "Who?" Charles met his gaze, his expression haunted. "Our father." A beat of silence. Lestrade blinked. "But your father is dead." Charles nodded grimly. "That's what I thought, too." Holmes was already moving, pacing slowly in front of the fireplace, his mind piecing together the threads. Finally, he exhaled. "Then the question becomes simple. If Lord Reginald Montague is alive, where is he now?" Charles hesitated. I don't know." Montague's gaze darkened. "You are lying." Charles' expression flickered. "I swear, Alfred, I only knew that he disappeared. That's all." Holmes suddenly stilled. He turned toward Charles. "Kay," his eyes like steel blades in the dim light. "You were told he was dead." Holmes murmured. Charles frowned. "What?" Holmes took a slow step forward. "You were told he was dead." "By whom?" Charles swallowed. By Hale." Holmes exhaled softly. "Now we are getting somewhere." Lestrade frowned. "What are you thinking, Holmes?" Holmes' voice was calm, steady, deadly sharp. I am thinking, Lestrade, that Hal did not order Montague's death to protect the family name. He did it to protect the secret that Lord Reginald Montague was still alive. A heavy silence filled the room. Montague's voice was barely above a whisper. You mean Hale was covering for my father? Holmes nodded. Precisely. Lestrade exhaled sharply. So you think the old man's still out there, pulling the strings? Holmes smiled faintly. Oh, I do not think, Lestrade. Oh. Montague's voice was tight with anger. Then where is he? Holmes' gaze glinted with a sharp understanding, and then, softly, he murmured, Highgate Cemetery. A shiver ran through me. Lestrade frowned. What in God's name would he be doing in a bloody cemetery? Holmes turned to Montague. Tell me, when you were buried alive, what was the last thing you heard before you lost consciousness? Montague hesitated. I don't know. Voices, footsteps, and then his breath hitched. A man speaking. Holmes nodded once, as if confirming something. A man with power, okay? A man who has been in the shadows all this time. Lestrade blinked. You think he's been hiding there? Holmes smiled thinly. No, Lestrade, I think he never left. Silence settled over us, and in that moment I realized something deep and terrible. We were no longer chasing a man, we were chasing a ghost. The midnight air was sharp and biting as we arrived once more at Highgate Cemetery, the fog curling like spectral fingers through the iron gates. Holmes stepped forward without hesitation, his greatcoat billowing as his keen eyes swept the darkened tombstones. Montague was beside him, his breathing measured, though his hand twitched near his coat, where I knew a pistol rested. Lestrade followed, his revolver drawn, his jaw tight with unease. Holmes, I murmured, my breath fogging in the air. If you are right, if Lord Reginald Montague is still alive, then he has spent 10 years orchestrating a deception. A man like that will not simply surrender. Holmes gave me a slight, knowing smile. Indeed, not, Watson. But men who thrive in the shadows seldom expect to be dragged into the light. Lestrade exhaled sharply. Where are we going? Holmes gestured ahead. To Montague's grave. That is where this began, and that is where it shall end. The gravestone loomed before us, the inscription half worn by the elements. Here lies Lord Alfred Montague. 1839-1872. Holmes stepped forward, his gaze sharp and unrelenting. Lestrade, the lantern. Lestrade lifted his oil lamp, its glow casting long shadows across the ground. Holmes knelt, his fingers tracing the edge of the disturbed earth. Montague swallowed hard. You're certain he's here? Holmes did not look up. I'm rarely uncertain, Lord Montague. Then, with chilling precision, Key pressed his palm against the soil land. It gave way beneath his hand. I took an involuntary step back. Good Lord. Holmes straightened. Hollow ground. His gaze flickered toward Montague. It was never a true burial. The grave was a door. Lestrade cursed. You mean to tell me there's a passage beneath the bloody cemetery? Holmes smiled faintly. Oh, I mean to tell you that our quarry is waiting. Without hesitation, he reached for his cane and pressed it into the earth, revealing a hidden trapdoor. A gust of stale air rose from the darkness below. Holmes turned to us. Shall we? The tunnel was old and narrow, the walls damp with moisture, the wooden beams groaning under the weight of the cemetery above. The passage stretched deep into the earth, disappearing into the darkness beyond. Holmes led the way, his steps silent but certain, his hand resting upon his cane. I followed, my revolver drawn, my pulse hammering against my ribs. Montague and Lestrade came last, their footsteps echoing softly, their breath shallow and tense. Then a flicker of light ahead. Holmes halted. his gaze fixed upon the glow of a single oil lamp in the distance. We advanced slowly until at last we emerged into a low stone chamber, the air thick with the scent of old parchment and candle wax. And there, seated behind a grand mahogany desk, was Lord Reginald Montague. He was older, thinner, his face lined with age and shadow, but his eyes were sharp as ever. He did not flinch as we entered, nor did he move to reach for a weapon. Instead, he merely folded his hands and smiled faintly. So, he murmured, his voice as smooth as polished steel. "You have found me." Montague staggered slightly, his breath hitching in his chest. "Father," Reginald exhaled. "Ah, Alfred, you look well for a dead man." Holmes' sharp gaze flickered over the room, taking in the ledgers stacked neatly upon the desk, the maps pinned to the walls, the row of keys hanging from a hook. He smiled faintly. "You never left, did you?" Reginald chuckled softly. "Why would I? The world believed me dead. I simply allowed them to continue believing." Lestrade's jaw clenched. "You've been running your empire from beneath a bloody cemetery." Reginald nodded, quite efficiently, I might add. Montague's hands curled into fists. "You let me believe you were dead. You let my brother take my life. You let Hale orchestrate my murder." Reginald sighed. "Yes," a long silence. Then Holmes spoke, his voice light but cutting. "And yet, you made a mistake." Reginald arched a brow. "Did I?" Holmes stepped forward, his gaze piercing. "You kept your empire alive, but in doing so, you left a trail, a hidden fund, a name in the ledgers. You could have disappeared entirely, but you were too proud to let go of control." Reginald's thin lips curved slightly, in pride. "Mr. Holmes," he gestured toward Montague, "said not pride that led my son here as well." Montague's voice was tight with fury. "You tried to erase me." Reginald sighed. "I tried to keep you safe." Montague's breath hitched. "Safe," Reginald met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "Do you think I built my empire without enemies, Alfred? Do you think they would have let you inherit it freely?" Holmes nodded slightly. "So, you buried him before they could." Reginald's fingers drummed softly against the desk. It was the only way to ensure the Montague name survived. Montague's eyes darkened. "You mean to ensure you survived?" Reginald inclined his head slightly. "That too." Lestrade stepped forward, his revolver leveled. "Enough talk. You're coming with us." Reginald chuckled. "I rather think not." Holmes' gaze sharpened. "You planned for this?" Reginald smiled faintly. "Of course." Sudden rumbling echoed through the chamber. Holmes' expression hardened instantly. "Done now." The ceiling groaned. Then the tunnel behind us collapsed. The dust settled in thick clouds. And when I blinked the rubble from my eyes, I saw Donald Montague was gone. Holmes exhaled softly, brushing the dust from his coat. Montague staggered forward. Where is he?" Holmes sighed. "Gone." Lestrade swore under his breath. "Damnation. He set the trap himself." Holmes turned toward the desk, picking up one of the ledgers, his expression unreadable. Montague's voice was hollow. "So what now?" Holmes closed the ledger. "We wait," he said softly. Montague frowned. "For what?" Holmes smiled faintly. "For the dead man to make his next move." A week later, an unmarked letter arrived at 221B Baker Street. Holmes opened it, his gaze flashing with amusement. "You have one, Mr. Holmes. Or perhaps you have simply postponed the inevitable. Either way, remain, as always, watching." Holmes exhaled. "Interesting," he murmured. I swallowed. "Holmes, do you think we'll ever find him?" Holmes smiled slightly, setting the letter aside. "Oh, my dear Watson, I rather think T will find us."